Hey everybody, we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
You are exceptionally welcome to our content today. If you don't know us, hello. We're two doctors. We have social science degrees from an institution across the pond. And we use these social science degrees to examine all sorts of bits of culture, popped, lived, any variety. We do so in service of our goal to be educators around empathy and inclusivity, which means we look at all of these different cultural productions in a way so that we can learn more about others and what makes them human, how they live their lives, so that we can be those empathy builders, because we really do believe that it will make the world a better place. It strongly motivates the work that we do. We also love to talk to each other, which is another reason why this content exists. But we love to talk to you as well. So please make sure that wherever you're engaging with this, you do all of the platform appropriate things, liking, subscribing, reviewing, sharing, any other adjective you can think of that is positive. We do enjoy to have conversations. So make sure and comment with questions below, and we will chat back to you. Make this more of a conversation rather than the two of us sitting next to each other, staring at a blue light.
This particular coverage is about Hulu and FX's documentary series Pride, which came out in the summer of 2021 and ostensibly covers the decades of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and aughts. And this episode is about the aughts. Now, even though the series has had 6 different directors, and in the 90s episode was co-directed by 2 people, this has a much more spiritual connection to the 80s episode, excuse me, rather than the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 90s.
Yeah.
So it was much more artsy. It was it was a little bit more focused on the 2020s actually than we were prepared for.
We didn't get a lot of the contextual, like academic, social, like journalist kind of people that give us the context.
It was all just vignettes and disconnected ones at that. So there's a lot of very important things that happened in the aughts in terms of queer equality and queer life. One of the kind of 3 of the biggest is the continued bifurcation of mainstream queer life and radical underground queer life. That as Hollywood truly began to embrace varieties of queer stories more and more in the aughts. Will and Grace, hello.
Yes, in what they called the post-closet era.
The post-closet era.
Yeah.
Those stories throughout the aughts were still very gay and lesbian binary and very white. And very, very much older narratives as well, middle-class narratives, a lot of stuff like that. The more there was still very radical zine scenes and much more radical performance art happening, especially on the American coasts, and some things like that. Then the other is the fight for legality of marriage equality, which started in Massachusetts. And that was the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. And then the kind of third narrative is the constant conversation of who is Pride for, and should we have Pride if we're not all liberated? And the series touched on all of them. This episode touched on all of them in one way or another, and for our kind of contextual academic minds, because they tried to do all of them and did none of them well, much like the 80s episode. Additionally, they concentrated 2 of the vignettes, or I should say, one of the vignettes was about Cece McDonald. And if anyone doesn't know who she is, she was in 2011, so outside of the 2011, was arrested in Minneapolis, for defending herself against a transphobic attack. Her attacker died, and she was arrested and convicted of his murder, essentially was sent to solitary confinement. It's a whole thing. It is, in particular, her case is what activated my awareness of the plight, I hate that word, but like the specificities of being trans in America, and specifically Black trans women. So I was glad that they included it. At the same time, it wasn't part of the aughts. And so I was a little bit confused. Again, we spend a lot of time with Cheyenne Dorashow and the Black Trans Lives Matter March of 2020. We're not quite sure why, because there were other stories to tell about the aughts that didn't get told. I would have loved a much more vibrant exploration of the role of media. They mention, that it was a problem because it was all, white and binary. And at the same time, it wasn't. They bring up Pose. Pose did not come on in the aughts. They bring up Orange is the New Black. It did not come on in the aughts. But Queer as Folk was on in the aughts. They talk about the L Word and that's it. They show a clip of Glee, but like Glee was a real big deal. Santana and Britney were a very big deal to millennials and Gen Z. A lot of other freeform ABC Family shows were huge deals for Gen Z. Freeform was doing much more transgressive political shows before anybody else, and it does not get credit for that. It's a much more inclusive channel than nearly any other channel. Did not get a mention. And Ellen was the first, I believe, out person to host a talk show. That didn't get a mention.
It was the first person to come out on television and to have a gay character be the starring character.
Yeah. And that while that happened in the 90s, it wasn't covered in the 90s or the aughts episodes. So there's some interesting, every documentary has a narrative to tell. And when you pitch this one as a 6-part documentary, you pitch it as a cohesive narrative, and it was not. And so that was a little bit, I wish there would have been one executive producer who storyboarded all 6 of them.
Yeah.
And instead it seems like they handed 6 different directors the keys to the kingdom and said, have fun.
Yeah. And I think, you risk losing people, viewers, and when you don't tell as a cohesive story, or when you try to tell too many stories. And this certainly did. And it started out very similarly to the 1990s. We get a really interesting profile of Margaret Cho and her process of identification, and her comedy, being a woman, being a bisexual identifying woman, being an Asian American, and trying to navigate all of that in the early 2000s was oh, okay, cool. We're going to do this now. And then the almost the rest of the episode was about the trans movement and trans rights in the 2010s and 2010s.
With the exception of Brontez Burnell.
Yeah.
It's the rest of the episodes about Black trans women, essentially.
Yeah, and trans activism.
Oh, and trans activism, because Dean was in there as well.
Dean was in there, and Chase, I can't remember their last name, but Chase is a trans lawyer, an advocate that I see on television a lot. So I appreciated that connection. And it's important to talk about the intersection of queer liberation and trans life. And we don't talk about trans life. And so a lot when we talk about lesbian and gay stuff, and we know this even from this series, but as we were discussing it offline after we finished watching, it just felt like they wanted to tell a very specific story at times about Black trans women and Black trans life. And that's great. And I would love to see that story. And you can give me Cheyenne Dorashow for days. I want an entire 6-part series on her life. But it felt so disconnected from the other stories they were telling. And especially the way they told this one, they did a lovely profile on the couple who was involved in the Massachusetts case, David and Rob, for marriage equality, and David being a Black man identifying as gay later in his life. And
that was lovely.
All of that stuff was really, really good. And then the rest of the focus shifting towards trans stories, it made it seem like that was the most important story. And then it was also disconnected. We can't figure out if this was filmed before COVID, and then, or before, more specifically before George Floyd and this latest growth in Black Lives Matter protests that we saw last year, the mass movement of it. it feels like those were afterthoughts. Like
Yeah.
they felt like, oh, we produced this show, but now it's getting released in 2021 and we have to talk about it. And like there's a way you can do that and add it in. I agree, they have to talk about it. Like do a separate episode.
It was strange too for us because they kept bleeding the aughts and the tens together.
Yeah.
So like they talked about the marriage equality in Massachusetts in the aughts, never brought up the Supreme Court ruling in 2015 in the United States, then talked about CC McDonald, who's in 2011,
Yeah.
and didn't talk about like the only really truly like Obama signed the hate crimes legislation, the Matthew Shepard Act in 2009, I think.
Yeah, it was first term.
And they make the point like that the hate crimes legislation is really, this was an interesting contextual thing, within the community is very difficult because all it really does is send more people to jail. It does not seem to be deterring crime.
Right.
And so that was an interesting, a couple different perspectives on that was really good. We did that for like 3-minute detour, but then there was 22 minutes of the episode that was spent on essentially 2020 and 2021.
Yeah.
In an episode about the aughts. That is, again, just an interesting decision that made it difficult to understand what, if these were priorities, and then if they were it was trying to hold some things in tension, but didn't hold all those things in tension. It's made it seem prioritized.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that we came to, we were reserving judgment on some things until we saw all 6 episodes. And, in the history of the way we have talked about queer identities in media, huge focus has been on gender binary or like, gender conforming lesbian and gay folks. And like they talk about that bias a lot, they address it, they still talk about like gay and lesbian folks and a whole diversity of expressions of that. And they focus a lot on trans folks as well in this docuseries, but we're missing still a lot of people from that very, very big umbrella. The show doesn't really deal with bisexuality, asexuality, pansexuality.
Demisexuality isn't mentioned at all.
And, that's a really, like, we already told you that we thought they took on too many things, but like, this is one of those where I think they thought they were correcting the ship in terms of the way trans folks have been erased or excluded or misrepresented, and they certainly have. And it's important to correct that erasure. But at points they went too far, and it felt like they were judging gender conforming queer folks who, it got a little too abolitionist at the end for us. And that's certainly a perspective you can have.
Oh my gosh, absolutely.
And, to present it is important because there's a lot of people, regardless of where you fall on any spectrum, that feel that, things like that in binaries should be abolished or erased or taken down. But there are people that ascribe to them, and there are people that identify as them and are very happy. And you can make the argument if you want that is, their cultural oppression or whatever kind of argument you want to make about it, but they still feel that way. And this docuseries did not leave a lot of space for folks that fit in some of those other pockets, especially in terms of gender and sexuality outside of LGBT. Really LGBT.
Yeah, there wasn't. I mean, they used queer as the umbrella term, but there wasn't
a whole lot of
there wasn't a lot of queerness.
There wasn't a lot of B happening.
There wasn't a lot of B. There wasn't a lot of Q. And the other thing too is that like this episode too, it featured a lot of Christians being terrible, and I was like, you know what? Yeah, but and I'm not trying to. Christianity isn't the only religion whose fundamentalist branch has trouble with queerness, and our fundamentalist branch is not the only branch. So this one, when I'll just be really honest, as a progressive Christian, when I see you using Westboro Baptist as the only really Christian voice,
or Jerry Falwell,
yeah. I'm like, oh, y'all have an agenda, and that's fine. But it's like it's the one of the biggest signals to me that you have decided who people of faith are. And in some ways, this is a lot of this. It's both the episode of the 80s and the episode of the aughts, is for all of their hatred of a binary. the screenwriter bifurcated people pretty easily. And then you just want, you want to point to the other 4 episodes and be like, that's how you hold many opinions in tension.
Yeah. And like, it was, and again, we said this at the beginning, and I think it's worth saying again, what the contextualization does when you have it. When you have people that say, well, in the broader 2000s, this is how we thought about this.
Yep.
This is what society felt about this. This is why we have this idea emerging. It's
important to keep in mind that these were the Supreme Court cases being fought, that this was the #1 show on television, that
all that does is give space to all of those different opinions without saying one is right or one is wrong. And they didn't openly say one is right and one is wrong in this episode, but it was a lot murkier about some aspects of it. Then if you have that context, you can say, look, all of these different and contradicting ideas about what it means to be a person who falls under the queer umbrella, or any person on any spectrum, there are contradictions and diversities across all of that. And when they don't say it explicitly, people fill in the gaps. And I think specifically with episodes 4 and 6, that's the problem we were having. Was we couldn't tell if they were specifically being a trans Black woman activist leaning show at the end. And if they were, that's fine. Just say what you're doing from the start and give the context for it. So I think
because they make a lot of really big statements. Like huge statements, like this XYZ caused more violence, or without contextual backup. What does more mean? What does that kind of stuff? What does violence mean? What are it? And when you speak and we know we're doing this too, when you speak in general terms without context, it's very challenging for people to be able to absorb that information in a way that can allow them to change their minds. And
in a way that they can process it critically. And not critical in the negative sense, but
critical and
in the analytical sense. And it's a lot of people don't know a lot of stuff about all of this history. And so when you're opening that wide of a door, I think you have to be really careful about how you open it and how you walk people through it. Because it's such a beautiful opportunity. And we still think overall the series is really valuable and shares a lot of stories that we had not encountered, or that we know a lot of other people hadn't encountered, even if we had. But the lack of care at times, or the lack of structure at times, was a real letdown for the potential of what it could have achieved.
That's a good summary.
And I don't know, we don't know anybody else that's watching it aside from some of our YouTube subscribers out there. So we can only talk amongst ourselves. So please let us know what you thought and how you related to parts of the story, whether you felt it was representational or not, if you identify as one of those folks. We'd love to, as we're researchers, gather more data from more humans about this. And hopefully it's a starting point to telling loads more of these stories on platforms like this, so that it can be accessible. But we were pretty meh about episode 6, y'all.
Thumbs up on the series overall, meh on episodes 4 and 6.
I think that's good. And that is our special edition Pride coverage for 2021. But if you know us, we talk about all things all the time. So we will be talking about more stuff, especially we got a shout out to YouTube subscriber Taylor, who recommended a YouTube documentary series on the ballroom scene, which
watch out for that.
We will be watching and then telling you about. So thank you, Taylor, for assisting us in our Google search of things. And all of you for all your comments and interactions and thoughts. Please let us know if you have recommendations for us. We will see you again for more coverage of just about any gender or sexuality anywhere on the spectrum. We will talk about it.
Absolutely. And we will see you then.
Bye.